I know I say this all the time, but there's a place in Middle-earth that frequently gets overlooked. To be fair, it isn't an overly important place by the end of the Third Age, it isn't a particularly dangerous place by Middle-earth standards, nor does it have a name that pops out of the pages. It is briefly encountered in The Lord of the Rings, although nothing of great note happens there. That said, this place was the location of one of the most destructive events that ever took place in Middle-earth, an event that would scar this land for thousands of years to come. In this video, we talk about the Brownlands, the site of Sauron's worst crime. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, you can see the Brownlands as one of the few labels between the River Anduin and the Sea of Rhûn. To the north of the Brownlands are the southernmost eaves of Mirkwood. To the west is the River Anduin, specifically the fordable parts of the river known as the Undeeps. To the south are the barren hills of the Emmenmuil, and to the east are the grassy plains of Rhovanion. We know that the Brownlands extend right up to Mirkwood, right across to the River Anduin, and right down to Emmenmuil. However, we do not know the eastern extent of the land. If I had to guess, I would say it would run parallel to the eastern edge of Mirkwood. In the early years of Middle-earth, the Brownlands didn't actually exist. We're told that Mirkwood, or Greenwood as it was known, extended further south during these years, although we're not sure how far south. Shortly afterwards, the Northmen arrived in Rhovanion, and significant parts of the region were deforested, but we're not sure if the area that would become the Brownlands shared that same fate, because during the First Age, they received different inhabitants, the Entwives, who had different desires than the Ents. The Ents wished to herd the trees, the Entwives wished to create gardens and grow vegetables and flowers. So the area of the Brownlands became the Gardens of the Entwives for thousands of years, presumably one of the most pleasant places in Middle-earth. The men who lived nearby benefited greatly from them. They came to the Entwives, who taught them many different things about agriculture, and in response, men honoured them. Meanwhile, the Ents, many of whom were still wanderers, would regularly visit the gardens and meet with the Entwives. The Entwives also seem to have come into regular contact with the Elves. But then the dark years of the Second Age happened. Sauron's power grew, the elves in Greenwood began to move away, and the men who were friendly to the Entwives were supplanted and replaced by those who were more wicked. That said, the Entwives were seemingly left alone. Even as Sauron's armies marched west, they did not attack the gardens. Despite how corrupted he had become, perhaps Sauron did not think the Entwives were worth the effort, or perhaps he just saw little reason in attacking them. The Dark Years lasted for almost 2,000 years of the Second Age, and it seemed like the Entwives were going to make it out the other side. And then Sauron found his reason. The War of the Last Alliance started, and the armies of Elendil and Gil-galad crossed the Misty Mountains and soon met up with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Greenwood and Loredan. They were going to be marching south down the River Anduin, and in their path were the Gardens of the Entwives. Sauron realized that the gardens would be friendly territory to the Last Alliance, a place where they could rest and resupply, and perhaps use as a staging ground for the assault upon Mordor. So, Sauron attacked the gardens. I'll let Tolkien's own words describe what happened. On the eastern bank to their left, they saw long formless slopes stretching up and away towards the sky. Brown and withered they looked, as if fire had passed over them, leaving no living blade of green. An unfriendly waste without even a broken tree or a bold stone to relieve the emptiness. They had come to the Brownlands that lay vast and desolate between southern Mirkwood and the hills of Emmenmuil. What pestilence or war or evil deed of the enemy had so blasted all that region even Aragorn could not tell. Treebeard also describes what he saw when he went to visit the Entwives. We crossed over Anduin and came to their land, but we found a desert. It was all burned and uprooted, for war had passed over it. And he's right, war did pass over it. Sauron destroyed the gardens to deny the Last Alliance a place of safety. We don't know what happened to the Entwives, they either died or fled, and Tolkien even wrote a letter saying that they could have been enslaved by Sauron and used for agriculture. I'm not going to use the big G word, because my last video, while it didn't get demonetized, it definitely still made an impact, I can confirm that. But basically, this was the big G word. Sauron preemptively wiped out or attempted to wipe out the Entwives, a people who had done nothing to him. And Sauron's crime wasn't just to the Entwives, it was to the land itself. As described in the Fellowship of the Ring, the Brownlands were utterly lifeless. There's no trees, there's no grass, it's just a wasteland. I'll point out that even Mordor had plants. That's how bleak the Brownlands were. And the Brownlands weren't the only place to suffer ecological destruction. The great forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath were also wiped out in the Second Age. But these places stayed green, and the forests did actually start to regrow. In the case of the Brownlands, this place had been so devastated that nothing could ever grow there again. It makes you wonder what methods Sauron actually deployed, because trust me, I'm from a country that burns down all of the time, and stuff does regrow. To create something like the Brownlands, you aren't just using fire. As you might expect, no one lived in the Brownlands after that. Isildur and his company passed over the Brownlands during their ill-fated journey back to Arnor. During the Third Age, the Northmen of Rhovanion spread far and wide once again, but the Brownlands, along with Mirkwood, were a barrier between the Vales of Anduin and the Eastern Plains, and distinct peoples rose up on either side of this barrier. And during Gondor's years of glory, the Brownlands were technically controlled by the Dunedain, although they obviously made no attempt to settle there. In fact, they had forts on the other side of the Undeeps, and the soldiers stationed there would have a wonderful view of perhaps the ugliest place in Middle-earth. The Brownlands would play an important role in the wars between Gondor and the Wainrider Easterlings. In 1856, King Narmakil II of Gondor, joined by Northman allies led by Mahari, would engage the Wainriders somewhere around the Brownlands. The battle was a disaster for Gondor. Narmakil II and Mahari were killed, and the Brownlands and everything east of the Anduin, besides Ithilien, came under de facto Wainrider control. In 1899, a second battle would be fought, and while it took place on Dagorlad instead of the Brownlands, the combined Gondorian and Northman cavalry would cross the Brownlands during their flanking of the Wainrider army. Hundreds of years later, in 2509, the Balkoff Easterlings, who were descendants of the Wainriders, would use the Brownlands as a staging ground before invading Carnarvon. The following year, they invaded, leading to the Battle of the Field of Celebrant and the creation of Rohan. The Balkoff were not the last Easterlings to pass through the Brownlands. They invaded Rohan at least 2 more times by crossing the Undeeps, which would have required crossing through the Brownlands. Our final view of the Brownlands is during the War of the Ring. The Fellowship travel past them while rowing down the Anduin, and later, Frodo and Sam pass through the edge of the Brownlands before passing through Emyn Muil. So, what becomes of the Brownlands after Sauron's final defeat? Well, we're not sure. Presumably they fell under the influence of the reunited kingdom and its allies, but I don't think that would change anything for them. If the land couldn't recover naturally after 3,000 years, barring the removal of some type of dark magic that might have been preventing things from regrowing, I can't see it being worth the effort for settlers to restore the place, especially when there was already so much better empty land to reclaim. At least for the early part of the Fourth Age, I wouldn't be surprised if the Brownlands remained a wasteland, a stark reminder of Sauron's crimes. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I think the name, the Brownlands, actually sort of disguises the atrocities that happened there, because I don't think it's a particularly ominous name. I think if they were called the Blasted Plains, or the Dark Wastes, or the Burnt Lands, it would sound far more interesting, and people would wonder, oh damn, I wonder what happened there, why is it called that? Oh well, if you didn't know, now you know. Cheers, farewell, and remember, unlike Greenland, the Brownlands do not falsely advertise.